I would now like to welcome up the first speaker of the affirmative team to start off their team's case. Here we go.
Adjudicator, are you tired of hearing about the same character, John, who's always the hero saving the world at the final moment? Are you tired of always hearing about the same character in every single piece of literature you consume? Do you want to shape your own destiny? 3 things here in this debate. Firstly, what does widespread adoption look like? Secondly, on the quality of literature. And thirdly, on longevity. Firstly, what does the widespread adoption of this literature theory actually look like? 3 things here. Firstly, more authors leaving ambiguous endings. There is an incentive for authors to no longer impose their ideas, such as like, oh, Jimmy's going to die in book 2. They now have an incentive to keep open-ended areas within their pieces because more people will enjoy these pieces of literature now that they're ambiguous. Secondly, on the influence of consumers. They're now given like creative freedom over the pieces of literature that they consume. There's this equilibrium of a book that fills some gaps, but also leaves holes for people that they can now that they're not able to relate to. I don't think it's okay. There's also a deeper connection to the text and also its characters. There's more incentive to purchase more pieces of literature because now they're able to connect with all of the characters better. And this ties back to the incentive of the author to produce more literature at greater amounts and higher quality levels. Thirdly, on the depth of characters. People are now able to interpret different characters in different ways. This is able to effectively build like small communities or fandoms for more popular interpretations. This was like characters written for bad reasons. For example, like some blonde bimbo character being able to have more depth than just being a cookie-cutter original character, and now communities are actually able to come along and bond over this. Secondly, on how this improves the quality of literature for consumers. This point is in 2 parts. The first part is on the enjoyment of consumers, and also the second part is on the quality of the stories. Firstly, on the first part, which is the enjoyment while consuming literature. The context for this point is that literature is made to engage and captivate audiences. What do audiences enjoy and what do audiences want? They want 2 main things. Firstly, they feel a sense of connection to what they're consuming, such as relating to Joy's perfectionism in Inside Out. And secondly, they want to feel like challenged, right? They like movies, books, and like other pieces of media that are made to be unpredictable because they keep the reader hooked as to what happens next. So how does the depth of the author, like literature theory, make people enjoy literature more? 4 main things here. Firstly, literature is going to become more interactive in the sense that the audience are now able to engage in literature with their own thoughts and opinions. Secondly, different interpretations are now taken online, and like discourse occurs. This gets more people invested into the literature, and also communities about like the text is now able to form. Thirdly, characters are seen as less objective. Again, like the example of like the dumb blonde, specifically like Cassie from Euphoria, like who's seen as this really boring, dumb, bimbo blonde stereotype. Now people are actually able to connect themselves over the character. So it's like, oh, it's actually about Cassie's male validation. There's actually a deeper meaning to this. But fourthly, cliffhanger endings and like unfinished mysteries leave audiences wanting more. On to the second part, quality of nuanced stories and literature. What is the context? Well, writers-directors must cater to what gets them the most sales because, well, they get more money and they get more exposure, and everyone wants more money and everyone wants more exposure. But if audiences want to project their experiences, internalization of their opinions onto literature, then creators will be able to develop more nuanced character plots. So why is nuance important for the quality of output of literature? 4 things here. First, there's more room to explore controversial topics such as like homophobia. On the flip side, there's limited room for controversy because the author may face blame. Like, DA removes pressure off of authors to be politically neutral or correct all of the time. That's what we're seeing on that side of the house. Whereas on our side of the house, we're able to see more diversity, such as like a Pakistani main character, right? That is because these directors as authors want to cater to niche audiences to expand the capacity for their self-projection. Thirdly, it maximizes potential resolutions in film. This means like ambiguous situations or ambiguous endings, and the audience are now able to use like critical speaking and like ideas to fill these gaps. Fourthly, on ambiguity and race for characters. This one's like quite interesting because it maximizes the capacity for like John to be Asian, Polynesian, or American, whereas on the opposite side of the house, like J.K. Rowling might write John to be English and something like a white man. Like That's so J.K. Rowling. No. On outcomes, people feel engaged and connected to literature, and now they're more inspired to become authors themselves. Secondly, literature becomes more diverse and nuanced, and this is more accessible to wider audiences. And thirdly, communities are formed over discourse and debates over social issues regarding the plot. Yes, I will take a point of it.
Do you not recognise that there may be certain reasons present at the time as to why a character is portrayed in a certain ethnicity as opposed to others?
I think it's interesting for the negating team to come up here and paint what we've been describing as a bad thing. We're offering pathways to more diverse representation. So are you trying to claim that it's a good thing for characters to always be one race? And that's a really interesting POI. It reveals a lot about the character of their case. Moving on to the third point here, which is longevity. What is the context for this case? Literature thrives on captivating readers. We can all agree on this, right? This means it's essential for a piece of literature to be valued in terms of being always interesting upon a read. So, no matter how many times I read it, whether it's 3 times, or 30 times, or 300 times, every time I read this piece of literature, it should always be interesting. A couple of myths here. Firstly, this means that when adapting this theory of analysis, it brings new joy to literature. So, I can read this piece of literature in the feminist lens, or I can read it in an eco-critical lens, or I can read it in a psychoanalytical lens. Each way I read it brings a different interpretation to it. Secondly, as this will allow books to get the full story, in order to get the full story, you must read it multiple different times. This increases the longevity of the story. But thirdly, it also increases the amount of times the reader spends with literature, right? And fourthly, it not only this, but also enriches the combined conscious of the reader, also with the knowledge, such as a community coming together. But fifthly, it separates art from artists. So authors that we've already established are quite controversial, such as J.K. Rowling, have very controversial opinions, but they can be separated from the art of Harry Potter, for example. And this increases the longevity of the literature here. And there's no longer this idea I have to boycott J.K. Rowling, but actually, I can keep reading Harry Potter, and I can bring new interpretations, I can bring new vision to Harry Potter. Onto the impacts of this. Firstly, more people engage with literature. This is different things with different interpretations, which increases the education of people. Because now, every single time they read it, they're slightly increasing their education, they're increasing different ways, they increase their exposure to literature. Secondly, authors get more exposure. So niche writers are able to gain a following and also make more impact, just like Andrew Benz. And thirdly, the good things, good book will still stand, and controversial.
Point of information.
Yes, okay, I'll take one.
Considering that J.K. Rowling hasn't really put her views in Harry Potter, don't you think that someone who wants to read the text aside from the author's views can do it on both sides of the house?
Okay, I think that's interesting. But if we take example for I don't know, Diddy, right? No one really likes Diddy now that we know he molests children and stuff. But after that, people no longer want to say, I'm going to listen to Diddy's music because they're really afraid that people are going to boycott them. I think it's more about the idea of security that people can say, I'm going to engage with this media because I'm interpreting it in a different way. Yes, moving on. All 3 of these points should be weighted really heavily, right? Because we went on 3 scales here. Firstly, 3 metrics here. Firstly, on scale, we're able to impact more people as it is always up to the interpretation compared to just one person, such as the author. Secondly, we also went on severity. People can now make deeper connections with the characters to a personal level due to the ambiguity, such as about race. They're able to project their own race onto the character because they want better representation of their culture. And thirdly, on longevity. Literature on our side of the house allows for more nuanced understanding and time to be with the book. This allows for a longer life for the book, and it's going to pass on longer and longer. This is why the motion stands. Proposed.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now welcome up the first affirmative speaker to present the team's case.
I don't know why you guys read, but I read to escape the problems of the world around me. I live for that 20 minutes in bed every night, reading my favourite book to try and escape my problems and get into another character's problems. Alright, in this speech, I'm going to go over a small amount of rebuttal for the first affirmative team speaker and explain why actually this death of author technique makes people have a lack of exploration, a lack of different views around the world, and actually harm society. And then move on, and that's going to tie into our first point about the impact on the authors and readers and their perception of the world. And then we're going to go, and then we'll come into our second point about historical validity and how this applies to some historical texts too, and how this technique is extremely harmful in that way. So some rebuttal. The first affirmative speaker has told us that more authors are going to leave ambiguous room with us and will give people more creative freedom when they're reading. However, we see that, no. The problem with this, far out my handwriting, is that when authors write a text and someone reads it, the reader wants to expand and learn more. They want to look at new ideas. They want to think about the world in a different way. And if much of the text is left open to interpretation, then they could actually get stuck in a rut. We talk so much about how the algorithms and social media mean that people are stuck in this and reading the same stuff, exploring the same views. And we think that if this technique is adopted, it might happen in reading too. If so much of what you're reading is open to interpretation, you could just make it the same way every time. We all have our unconscious biases. I love happy endings. I get so grumpy if they're not happy. But it's good for me to read things with sad endings because not everything is a happy ending. And so it's really important that you get exposed to a wide range of text. And there's still room for interpretation when you read a text. But it doesn't mean that it's all completely ambiguous and you have to kind of decide how it goes. Readers care about the characters. They want to know what happens to the characters. They don't want to be like, oh, okay, well, I didn't really learn anything from that. And therefore, actually, books aren't going to be have this longevity over time. So just going to be echoes of everything else that's said around the times. And for instance, think if, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice was written like this, you'd learn nothing about the Regency period and nothing about the fascinating views that the best thing a woman can do is marry and get all grumpy about that. And also what we could see here would be perhaps the disregarding of authors. Authors want to communicate something that they are passionate about in their writing. And if they just have to leave it open to ambiguity because everyone wants to be able to fit what they want in a book inside that author's work, then the authors are going to feel like they can't actually express themselves in the same way that they wanted to. I mean, part of why people write is they want people to see their books, understand their characters, and I think that we're going to have such a better society if people are reading a wide range of books, some things that challenge them, some things they disagree with, because then we might get more acceptance, less prejudice in our society, and wouldn't that be such an incredible thing if people didn't try to fit them into their mould because they're used to doing that with their books and used to seeing the same stuff on their social media, but if they could explore and learn new things. I'll take your POI now.
Yep, so different author allows communities to form through multiple perspectives. How do you propose new perspectives be formed through literature if there's always like a correct answer?
Well, I think that communities form around books because people are talking about their opinions of what the author has said and learning about it, not because everyone has kind of a little bit of a framework in the book and they're all talking about the way they finished it differently. That's not challenging, that's just echoing in the same brush like the algorithms of social media. And also there's readers who read to escape. I read because I want to learn about someone else's problems. Like, okay, this woman might have like 3 men in love with her or something. That's not the problem that I have now. But I want to hear about her problem because I don't want to have to think about my NCA biology because it sucks. I want to think about all the men that she's trying to sort out which one she likes best. So rather than leaving it open to ambiguity, I want to be able to think about their problems and escape. So therefore we see that readers can't escape, they can't learn new stuff, and the authors can't explain their thoughts. So something else we're going to go into is historical validity. A lot of texts are historical texts. And people, if this technique is applied when reading a text, people are going to use their values to read the source. And this means that the integrity of these sources will drop. An example of this might be, for instance, in the Bible, women in a certain part of it are told not to speak in church. And if you look into this with the intent of the author, it's because there were, at the same time, other pagan religions that existed where the woman was speaking, and in the church, this specific church, the woman was speaking and contradicting what those who believe in Christianity believe. And so people could misread that these things. And indeed, we have that in like Brethren societies where women say, no, you can't speak in church at all, and they're not allowed to share some of their opinions or even do a reading or something. And that's where dogmatism has been affected because people don't take into account what the author was actually trying to say. And this is something that has a detrimental effect on women because because it removes their freedom of religion. It also degrades the continuity of the source. If everyone looks at
You know why?
Yep.
How do you ensure that like popular authors do not project unhealthy stereotypes within their books?
Well, I think that that's always going to be discoursed anyway in a healthy society. It's not so much about what's being written in the books. There'll always be some controversial books, and it's important to read stuff you disagree with and stuff you think is wrong. And that's what we're talking about, escaping the rut, because it's actually a good thing for authors to have some controversial characters. And if those characters exist in literature, that's when they're going to be told that that's not okay. Whereas if it's open to interpretation, people might have the same interpretations that kind of project these stereotypes further. And therefore, what we see when people aren't reading history and through the eyes of the text is that people can't understand the history. They might draw the wrong conclusions from it about the time period, and they might, apply their dogmatism of a significant text wrong. So what we see here is people who are reading history wrong, people who are coming to the wrong conclusions because they're not thinking about the author's intent. Maybe they use slightly different language and words meant different things in that time period, and you go, oh, okay, and you understand it wrong. And there's big problems when people don't understand history, because history shows why we are where we are now. History is so important to look back, to go forward in our society. So here on the affirmative side, we have proved to you that you need a wide range of established characters, established endings, to encourage people to open their eyes and their mind to more variation. You need people to read history and think about the author's intent, not just go, oh, okay, I'll just look at what the words say. And therefore we believe you'll have a healthier society who questions things, who reads a wide range, who opens their mind, and is less susceptible to prejudices, therefore.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now welcome up the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue their team's case.
Mr. Adjudicator, if I could read, I'd want to read books that challenge my mind. But unfortunately, I cannot. Anyways, two things in this debate. Firstly, I'll be responding to the two major pushes we heard from the negating side, being firstly on perception and historical validity. And secondly, I'll be continuing on my team's substantive case, and on to my first speaker's third. Firstly, through my responses now. One of the biggest pushes we heard from the negating team was this idea of perception. A few responses. Firstly, they tried to argue that you will learn more on their side when you have these pre-made outcomes, because it means you're more actively trying to understand what the author's message is and all that kind of stuff. A few responses to this. Firstly, we see in actuality, you actually learn more on our side of the house for a few reasons. Firstly, your brain's actually challenged to try and interpret these open-ended endings. Meaning that because it's not laid out for you, you have to kind of try and gain that perception yourself, which is an extra layer of analysis and brain thinking that you don't get on that side of. And secondly, they tried to bring up this thing about trends and algorithms, and how we would fall into just interpreting endings that we like in these kind of open-ended books. A few responses to this. Firstly, we just see that it's actually more likely that those trends appear more on their side of the house when they don't have the ability to actually interpret their own endings, because as they pointed out, we tend to lean towards things that we like reading on their side of the house. They don't get the opportunity to actually go out and engage with more books, because they'll just be getting books that they like, with endings that they like, storylines that they like, characters that they like. Whereas on our side of the house, when there's more things up for interpretation, you get challenged more to think about that and more deeply interpret the characters in different ways, like my first speaker talked about. Okay. And secondly, they also talked about this idea of disregarding authors. A few responses to this. Firstly, we can see that authors often write their books because they want to write for the people, at the end of the day, an author can write a book because they want to write a book. But if there's no one to read the book, like myself, and I can't read, there's no point in writing your book.
Point of information.
Sure.
Do you not realise that individuals often write books just as an expression of their own thoughts, as a way to kind of convey their emotions or their beliefs on something, regardless of, say, the marketability of it?
No, because most of the time, in the mainstream, you're not gonna write a book. You're gonna write a book that can make you money. You're gonna write a book that people will actually want to read. So yeah, maybe this is like small point about expressing your feelings, but as my first speaker talked about, it's all about getting your book out there, getting that massive appeal, getting it out to the people to read. Because there's no point in writing a book and keeping it on a shelf. It's gotta keep it in the hands of other people to actually interpret. And also, yeah. Oh, and actually, that works as an incentive for authors to actually want to keep writing books. Because when they see, as my first speaker talked about, as they see, when people are more engaged with their writing, when people actually pick up their books and want to read them, they get this incentive like, oh, people must like the way I'm writing, I want to continue this style. And that way, authors feel more incentives on our side of the house to want to keep writing and furthering their careers. And we also, as my first speaker pointed out, we give a platform to these more niche writers like Andrew Brenner and all these kinds of people to actually expand, and become more mainstream and grow their following. Yes. Now, onto this point around historical validity, and this is something they bring up heavily in their first speaker's speech. In response to this first speech, you see, it's a massive kind of logical leap to try and group, all this historical writing into this kind of idea of open-ended writing. Because we see a lot of the time, a lot of historical writings are actually left up to interpretations of the historians at the time. As they say, history is written by the winners, So a lot of the time, historical pieces are actually, opinion pieces or perspective pieces. Meaning in the nature.
Information.
Sure.
Don't you think then that death of the author would mean they wouldn't think about what perspective the author was writing from, and just look at the text?
Say that again.
Don't you think that then death of the author technique would mean that they would just look at the text, not what the author is meant to say?
I feel like they read between the lines and gain a deep understanding of that same situation. Because, as I said, the author's writing from their own perspective, they might not have encapsulated everything that was happening at the time, because that's written from, because history is often misrepresented by the people that win, by the people that write it. Meaning on our side has to get a better full encapsulation of all the events that happened at that time. And also, they talk about how, also, another thing to point out is that historical literature is often very difficult to interpret. A lot of the times people actually have to take their own creative liberties to understand the full meaning of these writings, because a lot of the time they're not fully laid out for you. They're not, they're not the easiest things to interpret. Which means, one, we get more discourse around these topics to try and engage with them, as my first speaker talked about. And secondly, we just get more people's eyes on literature, which we feel is the most important thing. Because when people are engaging with literature, all this literature gets a bigger platform, it gets more exposure, and that kind of thing. But before moving on, I will take a POI if there is one. No? Oh, no. So moving on to how social discourse is improved, which is a big push our team is leading, and something that the negating team has failed to really push back or respond to. So firstly, because this mission stirs, a lot of times this mission helps to stir up controversy through endings and morally great characters, which looks like maybe leaving a character's origin ambiguous, that way, and inviting you to try and better understand or interpret their actions and things like that. This comes through characters like for example, Thomas the Tank Engine. Stay with me now, Thomas the Tank Engine. We didn't understand his motivations. When we first see Thomas the Tank Engine, he's a small engine shunting in a big yard. We understand that he has a dream. But we didn't understand what this dream is. As we follow his journey, we see him grow as a character. We see him get Annie and Clarabelle, his trusted characters. We see him get his own branch line. But we don't understand why he's doing these things. It's not later on in the books, in the railway series, that we learn that he comes from a war-torn background. And it's that kind of deeper understanding that they could get on the inside. So we could have thought all these things about
Point of
Thomas the Tank Engine.
information.
Wow. Oh. Sure.
Don't you think that the fact he comes from a war-torn background is something we're told by the author, not something that the reader has to figure out, therefore doesn't follow the death of author theory?
Stay with me now. Stay with me now. Oh wait. See, I misinterpreted that wrong. See, that's why the death of author thing is so important. Because it challenges you to think hard. If I didn't have to think hard and misinterpret and misremember his backstory, we wouldn't be talking about those kind of interpretation methods today. Anyways, this also shut down the importance of the author's viewpoint and shifts focus onto audience perspectives. Meaning that if the author comes from a very conservative background, or the author comes from a very Eurocentric background, you're not locked into the perspective of that said author. You can then hop in the driver's seat and say, well, I understand the story from my perspective. Or you understand the story from your perspective. It helps readers be more engaged and more actively enabled in reading stories and really getting it's closed actually, and really getting the full meaning behind it. And also, this is how I form this big point that we've pushed a lot down the line and hasn't really been responded to. This is how we form that discourse and that discussion in that community that also helps keep literature alive, which is something we believe really strongly in. So that is why we are proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now welcome up the second speaker from the negating team to continue their team's case.
I'm really sorry.
Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. What is more prevalent to the progression of humanity as a race? Is it the formation of fan clubs and for the enjoyment of fictional text, or is it rather the formation of manipulation and control structures that arise from the formation of historical bias? 3 things I'm attempting to achieve in this speech here today. Firstly, discussion of a clash regarding the setup clash regarding some context on the marketability and intent of authors. Secondarily, a clash raised that I think is separate on social discourse and the implications of both teams' case and the implications of both teams' portrayal of the sphering on such discourses. And thirdly, really the clash and the implication of presentism bias and of historical validity, really what we believe for the people who are greatly affected by it. So onto the main clash of setup. So these mainly being why texts are constructed. We see a very limited contextual scope in the opposing team. We very much see it in a commercialised Western sense, whereby you are producing a book in order to generate profitability. You want to generalise it to maximise your yields on your production volumes. You produce a book in a very commercial sense, whereby it's not really, it could be partially a cathartic expression of your emotions, of your perspectives, but really it's entrenched in this idea of appealing to as many people as possible in order to generate profitability, opposed to texts of the prior age, where yes, there was public appeal. Obviously you need to write in a manner which is respectful of your audience, but you're writing in a manner which just tries to widely publicise it as possible. We believe this kind of really narrows and kind of constrains the scope of this debate, and we want to really examine this widely. What type of sources are there, and where is this, and what extent does this theory go from these sources, and what has the greatest effect for society? So then, from this, we go from this very much a perspective of commercialisation. We think really this has only been really recent since kind of upwards of the 1950s, upwards of this kind of very, I would almost say Eurocentric ideal of writing. I would say as a construction purely for the generation of profitability, to construct as a Hollywood-style thing, to get your own blockbuster film produced, to have action figures created of the characters residing in such a text, to it to be a commercialised thing rather than to be an authentic expression of literary ideas. So this is one constraint we believe with the opposing team's case. So we very much think now they think, being a tenant of this, they say it's been exposed to a wide range of people now, and contemporary society will use the text they can see here. Society currently, we are seeing a decline in literacy levels, as in we have a baseline literacy level around the world which has increased as society has become more educated about engagement due to digitisation in many parts of the world, and particularly in the Western world. We're seeing actually a degradation in the level of people actually reading fluently and reading the length of text people are reading, and the scope of text people are reading on a regular basis. What does this imply for this debate? It means that only a smaller proportion of society actually reads, so it means the scope of perspective you get on that side of the house is just not as easily achieved. And the same thing with consumption of other media as well. The state of media, like the seriousness of it, is decline. It's not so much decline, but it's declining from the perspective of the amount of people engaging with it. And we're taking the usual example of books as fans. I don't think really to say that they claim the scope they claim as a tenant of their case. Really, if we can win this debate if we prove that the scope of this, while in their best case may be evident, is limited, is really limited when you look at the chronology of humankind. Okay, so now we go on to also another point they raise is the perspective of portrayals over time. We raise it as seeing yourself, the idea of seeing yourself being reflected for a text, and they use this the theme of ethnicity to show this. If a text was constructed, really we think one, this purposely kind of ignores is the vice we look at is why the author constructed. We raise a point of information. Why do authors construct characters in the way they do? Is it being representative of the approach that the author was exposed to? Is it being representative of a society the author is trying to portray? You have to, for quality historical examination, and we look at this, and we see this, like, even if individuals aren't subconsciously, if people are deriving the themes from this, if the themes really being explored, we're seeing kind of what you have to consider the background of the author. You have to consider what historical events were occurring at this time, what themes were prevalent, what ideologies were prevalent, what could have influenced them to lead this construction, what was the intent of this, what were they trying to convey. So really, and we see really this variation, we believe this is a symmetrical benefit as well, because variation in characters, because in a commercialised industry, we're likely going to get rewrite of this text rather than reinterpretation or formation of new texts which discuss similar themes, but rather are constructed for appeal, likely for profitability, to include more racial groups. We don't negate that this is beneficial. We rather say it's a symmetrical principle of having commercial literary market. Okay, on to social discourse. This has been a key push of the affirmative side here. So some points on social discourse. You will hear here that the discussion becomes more collaborative as views are less fixed. What we, one notion, we don't believe inherently that views are so much inherently fixed. We think every individual, views of things are heterogeneous. We outline that views are differing, views are variable. This is because in each individual's experience is just that, variable. We all have different lives that arise from different contracts, different perceptions and portrayals of the world. Okay, what does this mean? So it means likely it's very symmetrical that you're going to get different portrayals of this, but that doesn't mean just because there's different portrayals that the author has to construct the text in such a way that is not representative of the author's own portrayals. Rather, we believe the theory will not be constructed, because then really the author's intent, again in a very commercial sense, is just to manipulate the exposure of this theory to. But rather, what social discourse do we think we get? Okay, this ties into our point of presentism bias and historical validity really clearly. When we examine a wide range of historical texts, and we'd like to really define kind of what a text is. A text could be anything from a letter, it could be an opinion piece published in a newspaper, it could be a statutory requirement, it could be a legal document, it could be something like a receipt, an advertisement, political cartoon, any form of document. It could be even a visual, it could be in a visual form, it could be a film, it could be recordings, proceedings, etc., etc., etc. And this means we get a wide variety of texts being examined. They're all published for different reasons, but they all, and the purpose of this really historically when we examine texts is to determine what was historically being portrayed, so we can assess, okay, what were the values and considerations of that time, and does what is in this source, what does it imply for what actually happened at that time, and therefore the implication of history, how does that influence us today? So what occurs when you get presentism bias in this narrative? What is the implication? How does this really degrade social discourse? How does this worsen the kōrero that we get in their side of the house? And how is it exclusive? What we propose really is an alternative theory. We propose more something like a responsive historical theory, where historical text, or any text, because really any text is historical, it's just that the text is very recent as opposed to years prior, and every text becomes historical over time. So really, we propose that because individuals have different perspectives, but in order for valid assessments to be made, that are usually made by academics considering just the smaller range of reading on these, and historical texts we do acknowledge are difficult to read. That's why it's largely constrained to the academic profession. But because it's constrained to the profession, whatever these academics make has such a broad influence because individuals aren't consciously doing it themselves. So an academic can just really easily persuade these ideas, so we believe it can lead to manipulation of the sources because individuals use their own values to constrain what was actually reflected in the text. thereby impeding the quality of the judgments. This is why we are proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I now welcome up the third speaker of the affirming team to wrap up their team's case.
The reason why that 3 hours of sleep is extra hitting right now is because this debate was never supposed to be about historical books. This debate was supposed to be about literary theory, which is used to assess how the way that media and books shape the way and influence our society, and that is essentially what this debate is supposed to be about. I'm gonna basically talk a little bit, very minimally, about why this historical push doesn't necessarily matter. But I'm going to explain to you what does matter in this debate. And it's two things, right? Both sides have acknowledged that authors in this debate are extremely crucial because they're the ones that are producing this type of literature, right? They're the ones that are producing it for people to consume, for people to read, for people to be educated on things socially within schools and all of that kind of thing. And for that reason, we need to weigh up what is most important to them. Two things. Firstly, on the scale of people that are actually benefited by their work, and secondly, on the longevity of the reputation of their actual work. Okay, but before I get into either of those, I'm just going to clarify a few things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what this model what this looks like in the real world, because I think there was a bit of mess around it, right? And the thing is, I think that try and push the claim that these books are just going to be ridiculously open-ended. We think that's wrong for a few reasons. Firstly, for all of the reasons that they gave you about the authors wanting liberty and some kind of creative freedom in their own books, right? We think that if you buy that material, you're likely to buy the fact that they're going to want to have some kind of plot line. But secondly, what type of book do you have if everything is open to interpretation? We think that we outlined it beautifully to you at Alex as to what kind of things are likely to be switched up, right? For example, maybe it looks like open interpretation on what a character is going through, or the nuances of a character's sort of race or socioeconomic situation. Those types of things can differ depending on the type of book and the type of situation, but we think that authors do have some level of control.
Point of information.
Yes.
Don't you think that something such as the author, that a character's culture or their socio-economic background really impacts how the plotline would go then?
Not all the time. It's contingent on that. No, I wouldn't say that. All right, moving on. I'm going to talk to you firstly about the incentives of the author, right? Because we've already talked to you about why longevity matters so much. Because if, as they claim, they're so passionate about this work is because oftentimes creative industries are very hard to get into, they're very sturdy. This means that oftentimes they want the work and the creative interest to sort of pay off in the long term, and that's why I'll explain later why we went on that. But also note that this is probably better even if you have some creative trade-off. I've just explained why this creative trade-off is not likely to be as significant. But note, even if there's some type of marginal creative trade-off on our side of the house, we think that the longevity of the work is likely to be far more important. Right, so let's talk about longevity, Jen. Right? We tell you a few things. Firstly, on communities, right? Note that this material went largely unresponded to in the sense that you are able to form, they say that you only sort of stick to your own interpretation of a movie, but we just say that's not true, right? We literally outlined to you at Alex, at Cadell, of the social benefits of having things be up to interpretation, right? Like you have people on Reddit and Facebook being like, oh, I really hate the fact I think that Fred died, or I didn't think that Fred died, or I think Fred, I don't know, disappeared or wiped off the face of the earth, right? And you have people actually discussing the nuances of these different situations.
Point
We
of
think that's
information.
really beneficial. But I also want to flag, like Cadell's split here, which also we're largely engaged with, right? Because note that this like a lot of this debate revolves around sort of how like social issues are discussed and communicated in wider society, right? Because oftentimes the way that you get these issues through the door is you have people like claiming their different perspectives on it. I'm gonna weigh up which like perspectives we get, like whose perspectives are necessarily better on which side of the house, right? They say that we can have perspectives on their side of the house, but it's from the author's interpretation, right? But note that that's extremely tunnel vision, as opposed to having perspectives on whether or not, I don't know, like for example, Joe and you, like he's a serial killer. Is he over-glorified? Is he not over-glorified? Is the reason why we justify his killings because he caters to the female gaze? That kind of thing, right? And those are very pressing social issues that like we never deal with on their side of the house. But okay, let's talk about like this like push on how like history, right? Because we tell you like this is just not likely to be where this debate focuses in. Why is this? Because we tell you this debate is likely to focus on like fun books, right? Literally, the first speaker gave like a really great introduction about how she likes to like escape reality and read books, right? And I think I know far more people that have read like Harry Potter than any type of history book. People want to be invested in like I don't know, like romance books as opposed to like I don't know, sorry, like that kind of thing, because ultimately, that's what's more engaging to people, and that's what's more accessible to people. We think that the burden is on schools to deliver that kind of thing, but we think that like engagement and social problems and that kind of thing always need to be communicated through literature, and that is something that we are able to like enhance on our side of the house. I'll take a point now if anyone has one.
Do you not believe that the purpose of text is broader than simply just, or the significance of text is broader over time than simply just the entertainment of the initial audience?
Well, yes, because it's not just about entertainment of the initial audience. I literally just said that. Like, this is about like who is able to express those really nuanced social ideas more. We literally told you at first at Cadell that a lot of the times authors feel trapped in the sense that they either feel like they have to be overly politically correct, or literally, as the opposing side says, they feel that they are like sort of restrained in their tunnel vision perception. If an author is writing in their tunnel vision perception, well, who is to say that like their audience is not also subjected to that, right? As opposed to on our side of the house, when ultimately you sort of like take authors like out of the picture in the sense that their opinion and their critiques don't matter as much, you get far more engagement and you get far more people who are able to form communities off of that plot line, right? I'm just going to flag to you a couple of like the mechanisms as to why we get more engagement and why that's so important. Firstly, because people feel like frustrated, right? Like naturally, if like something is unfinished, a lot of times people feel frustrated, and people therefore like the plot lives in their mind rent free. They're constantly on Twitter. They're trying to find out what's happening, and that kind of thing, right? But also note that like these communities are where the social discourse happens, right? And when you remove the element of the author, you ultimately lay the reputation in the hands of the content of the book as opposed to the credentials of the author. Therefore, what we believe at the end of this point then is that the scale of readers and like sort of like knowledge that's like passed down through like how things work socially and sort of like the integrity of characters is far more developed and far more nuanced on our side of the house. On their side of the house, not only is it very short-termist, but the majority of their case relies on history, which I just told you is not a very relevant part of this debate proposed.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I now welcome up the third speaker from the negating team to close off their team's debate.
Right. The opposing team has, what they've basically done is attempted to redefine the word literature. This is more of a point of correction, I guess, I don't know. Literature is very broad. They've attempted to redefine it as, well, mainly fictional, is what they've based their entire case around fictional literature. Literature. They're basically case around fictional literature, but they failed to take into account either historical, which, well, they have regarded that. They have historical, which we have grown into great depth of historical literature, and literature that is just generally non-fiction, that is written with the intent of documentation, or sometimes with the intent of entertainment as well. Right. Quite simply, we believe we have won because we see two sides of this debate, okay? What we're seeing is the death of the author theory, obviously this is the main point of the debate. However, we're seeing across the debate how it applies to two contexts mainly, that is fiction and non-fiction literature, okay? This is the two battlegrounds that have been fought on in this debate. Now, we believe we won both of these contexts because we have proven that the death of the author theory results in the misinterpretation or an exclusion, in fact, of historical sources and texts. It can also allows for the weaponization of the original text. Those mainly apply to historical non-fiction literature. However, we have also proved that non-fiction texts matter more to the stakeholders than fictional texts, and that pathways to diversity are less important, slightly so, but they are less important to stakeholders than the preservation of the author's intent. Now, we can see that non-fiction is a massive part of literature, and that we can look back at it and say, yes, this is reflective of a time period, therefore it can become historical. However, we find that it is not as influential as non-fiction and historical literature. Now, however, going down, let's go for a moment, let's assume that fictional literature is in fact very, very important. Now, they have stated in the past that communities form from drawing the same conclusion about the open-ended book, about how this forms some sort of unity. And you said this, I believe, was your first or second speaker. But I'll just, thank you. I'd just like to point out how that makes sense, really. You said that communities will form when people draw the same conclusion about your open-ended book. But the basis of your case is that everyone's going to get a different conclusion. So there's just a bit of, okay, sure.
Do you realize that people can still form communities, like debating on disagreements?
Yes, well, debating is a sport of disagreements. And however, you said that people will come together in these communities when they agree on something. This would be the foundation of these communities. And we believe that this is wrong because if it's an open-ended book, they logically shouldn't agree on it. They all form their own conclusions. It's just a little bit confusing. However, again, they have said that when you read an open-ended book, you're challenged more to think, really, and it opens you up to these diverse viewpoints. Now, this is another logical bit of an anomaly in their case, as I'd like to point out that your brain fills in the gaps that's been left by this open-ended author with what you know, your perspective, and your experience. So, for example, if you are a girl and you're reading in a book that has a main character named Sam, unless there's any other contradiction to that well, you naturally assume that Sam is a girl because you're yourself a girl and you might know a girl named Sam. So this is something that you would logically assume. Right, and this illustrates the explicit bias and flaw in their case. Now, you are not going to consume any new information or perspectives when you are just filling in the blanks of someone else's half-finished perspective with your own. You're just further enriching your own perspective, and that's dangerous in itself. And yeah, the only way you can enrich your perspective is by looking at other people's perspectives, which comes from, as we have stated, literature with our sort of literature, fictional literature, with established plot lines and stuff that is different, exposes you to stuff that you don't know, that you don't fill in the blanks with stuff you know, that exposes you to something new. Right, now I'd like to touch briefly on the weaponizations of the original text. This, we believe, applies most to the historical and non-fiction parts of the text. Right. We find that the weaponization of these original texts is intentionally skewing the meaning of the text. Skewing meaning is intentionally disrupting and originally changing it, because it surfaces it looks that way, to serve the time period or an individual agenda, often with malicious results, and that we find it can cause harm. We find this often, as again mentioned with my first next speakers, with the Bible, how a lot of it can be taken out of the context that it was written in, and certain verses can be misinterpreted and weaponized to either fulfill personal agendas or just justify something bad that's being done. And now, I'd like to again touch on the point that my second speaker went to great depth on. That is, of course, presentation bias. Again, this applies mainly to non-fiction and historical literature, which we find to be more important. Now, presentation bias is commonly recognised by most historians as the fact that the values of the present time influence the interpretation of the text, no matter what area the text is from. This can result in an unfair reputational degradation or of historically unimportant or historically important sources and texts. A realistic example of this is, say, a Civil War historian writing a book about the Civil War. Shortly after the war, he may use the N-word, as was the unfortunate fashion at the time. It is heinous by today's standards and heinous in general, and rightly so, but back then it was normal, and results in the author being disregarded today for being racist, for losing him popular validity, even though he was acting accordingly in his time. And the death of the author theory encourages this. It encourages this exclusion of historical sources to the detriment of the truth, really, is what we find happens there. Another example, To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, fabulous piece of literature. Fictional piece.
Point.
Erica.
Why does this matter in the
Oh,
debate?
it's another example of presentism bias. And it was written by an American author, lawyer in 1950s America. It reflected the time. Well, okay, to summarise it, what I'm saying is, because of the death of the author theory, the original intentions of the author will not be taken into account on a wide-scale basis. Therefore, the texts themselves will be taken into account, and if the texts themselves are particularly, say, racist, as I brought up there, or feature things that we generally disagree with in today's modern period, then if we see that, we could discredit that, and like I said, unfairly discredit and discriminate against sources that will act in accordance of their time. Now, this is really the main cornerstone of that point. Now, quite simply, I would much prefer to live in a world where I'm exposed to more opinions, where I don't have to fill in everything in myself and put everything that I don't have to make everything fit what I believe. And I think I like it. I like being challenged about it. I think most people do. Like the feeling of knowing something different, that you don't have to fill everything in yourself as you're used to with non-fiction books. And we stand from a more diverse world that's just better in every way, and proud to stand.
I thank the speaker for that speech. As per tradition, we reverse the order. So I would now like to ask the leaders reply speaker from the negating team to finish off their team's case. Here.
Oh, that famous Mexican novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. Right. In this speech, I would like to go over the main clashes of this debate, looking at what both sides have told us, and before coming to the individual conclusion that us, the negating side, have won. So the affirmative team has told us that by using this death of the author theory, they have challenged people to interpret the text. They have told us there'll be more ideas coming from it, and a greater flow of ideas and different perspectives. However, we've told you that people are going to interpret it how they've always done, through the lens of what they always see. They'll make it more applicable to their situation. And so therefore, if literature is, if the author doesn't say things so explicitly, then people are just going to slip into this rush of thinking the way they've always done. And they're not actually going to get something new and engaging from literature, which, as we've told you, will lead to the lack of new views in our society and compound with other problems, such as we've told you, going down, what are they called, like potholes or something, in social media. They've also, the affirmative team has then come back and told us that people are going to weigh in their views of what they've taken with the books, and they've mentioned Facebook. Realistically, people don't go on Facebook to get new opinions. They go to tell everyone about their opinions and not yield. And even if this isn't true, the amount of people who realistically are going to have a passionate debate about what they think about books is very few. Okay, we see a set number of people read books, and that is the same on both sides of the house. But on the affirmative side of the house, less people actually have these passionate discussions about books. And so on our side of the house, more people are getting diverse viewpoints. On their side, less people, the people who can actually be bothered, are getting diverse viewpoints. They've also told us this will lead to more literature being read. People will be frustrated if the plot lines are unfinished, or people will want to know so that something really speaks to them. However, this is not actually doing anyone any good. I've told you, if you're reading literature because you feel like, oh cool, I can make this applicable to me and it can kind of share my views, then it's not really helping you. You might as well go scroll for an hour and it'll do you the same amount of good, because you're just getting stuck in that pothole. We see on our side, if you're going to read, then you will be exposed to more views, and this is good. We've told you how this will eliminate prejudice. So also the affirmative team have told us that the longevity of text will be increased on their side of the house. We said no, the text, the actual book might get sold throughout the years, but the text doesn't last because the text has no substance. The text doesn't represent the views of the author at the time it was written. And instead, people just read it and interpret it differently through the times. And so that's not really a text lasting. That's just people pleasing so that it can last for 100 years. And finally, there has been a lot of dispute about historical non-fiction texts, about whether they're actually valid texts. We still tell you that these are valid texts, and we have proven to you about the problems of people feeling like they're very open to interpretation. But even if the affirmative team still refuses to accept this and we go by their terms, these mechanisms still apply to, for instance, historically written fiction texts. And people may have to make sure they understand the author's intent in reading them and don't feel like they have to cancel the author, as we've told you before in our mechanisms. So when we come to the end of this, we see that we've proven to you that they'll be going down potholes on it's been a name, but anyway, you know what I mean, potholes on affirmative team's side, that there will be no new perspectives, and this is so detrimental to society. So proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and to wrap up the round 4, I would now like to welcome up the affirmative team's leaders reply.
Negating comes up here spending all of their time pushing this agenda that one outcome is the key to learning about historical texts, but I just simply do not think it is to the extent they'd like to push. I do not think that they can claim that we don't have any sort of educational benefit when the point of most NCA exams is to read a text and then apply your knowledge and your reading of it to it. If anything, we've got more educational pathways on our side of the house. But in saying that, Negating spent a total of 28 minutes pushing their side of the house. But as Manuia mentioned, this is not really the argument here that we want to be even debating. In fact, I think it's quite egregious for Negating to come up here and tell us a character's race is a definitive trait to their success or fail. But beyond that, their characterization of what this widespread adoption is also quite hyperbolic. But okay, even if we buy into this, even if we believe their best case scenario, their case still does not hold up. The reasoning here is threefold. Firstly, they perpetuate harmful stereotypes without an active way to actually mitigate or combat this. Negating here argues oh hey, it's okay. But is it? When poor Andy, this young Chinese boy, is a fan of Harry Potter and the only Chinese character in Harry Potter is Cho Chang, do you really think Andy feels empowered? It's quite interesting how Negating barely contests the stereotypes being perpetuated. I think it's really harmful for a reader if they need to if they read a story and continuously they see a character of their identity being once again, time and time again, being rejected from every possibility. In this case, the ambiguity of death of an author can be very strategic. Secondly, their literature is not as long term. This means that even though they're okay, yeah, short term, it's really good, but it's not long term. It's not going to last for a long time. But also literature needs to have a message, no matter how simply entertaining it is. And again, as mentioned time and time again, it is how the audience wants to interpret a book that tells us how long it can stay around for, right? And I think the main reason why they're pushing Pride and Prejudice, To Kill a Mockingbird, is actually, well, people can read it in many different ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a big piece of text, a big piece of literature within classrooms, within NCA exams, because it can be reinterpreted in so many different ways. I also like to bring up the whole history thing back. So Knight spends most of their whole case outlining how history will be rewritten, which okay, first of all, false. But even it's still a piece of paper, it's still gonna be there. But secondly, this is still not about really the debate, right? Even if we buy into this, we've heard from Cadell, it allows for a more nuanced understanding of historical content. We have heard some slight contention from this, but too late I third. Okay, now let's flip this and think about our side of the house. What we provide. We provide 5 main things here. Firstly, audiences are now able to have a deeper connection with the characters and the plot. And secondly, texts are also now more nuanced. Now, what this means is literature has a longer lasting effect, such as controversy in one text, but it also allows social discourse in book communities. Again, we've heard this idea that we never actually said anything, you said it's all about agree. That's actually false information, because at the top of my speech, I said disagreements can lead to communities as well. Anyways, fifthly, book characters are also now accessible to everyone. If we weigh up at the end of the day, if we weigh up the outcomes of both sides of the house, it will be quite clear who won this debate. Neg pushes for 3 main themes. Firstly, impactful writing without weaponization. Secondly, on the preservation of historical text. And thirdly, on better reading experience. Note that impactful writing and a better reading experience is not mutually exclusive to their side of the house. We want this as well. However, we have better mechanization, and negating has not fully or effectively contested. But if we move on, we also stand for more interpretation, we stand for more engagement, and we also stand for longevity of the text. When we weigh up both sides, we win on scale, we win on longevity, and we win on impact. Propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I thank both teams for what I thought was an awesome debate. I ask both teams to cross the floor, shake each other's hand, and to go way outside, please. Thank you.
It's